The tunnels beneath New York City had not seen sunlight for 30 years, and Jake Morrison liked it that way. Down here in the dark, the Zephyrians could not see them, could not track them, could not turn their weapons into useless metal with those terrible gravity fields that made human technology fail. Jake moved through the abandoned subway station like a ghost, his boots making no sound on the cracked concrete floor. Behind him, Lisa Carter checked her makeshift scanner one more time, making sure they were alone. The Zephyrians had come from the stars when Jake was just a boy, their ships like floating crystals that sang death songs in frequencies that made human ears bleed. They did not need better weapons or faster ships to conquer Earth. They simply made gravity do whatever they wanted, and suddenly every human plane fell from the sky. Every tank became too heavy to move, every gun too heavy to lift. In 3 days, humanity went from masters of their world to slaves digging in the dirt. Now the cities floated in giant bubbles above the ground, held there by Zephyrian gravity machines, while humans were forced to work in the deep mines below. The crystalline aliens sat in their floating palaces and watched as humans dug up the rare metals they needed for their empire. Most people had given up fighting years ago, but Jake remembered his father telling him that some battles were worth losing if they meant you could keep your soul. Lisa finished her scan and nodded to Jake. The tunnel was clear. They moved deeper into the darkness, following paths that Jake had memorized during 15 years of running from the aliens. Lisa had been a rocket scientist before the invasion, one of the few humans who understood how the Zephyrian technology worked. Now she spent her days taking apart alien devices and trying to figure out how to turn them against their makers. They reached the hidden room where Ben Rodriguez waited with the others. Ben had lost his wife and 2 children in the first days of the invasion, when the Zephyrians decided to make examples of anyone who fought back. His face carried scars from the gravity weapons that had crushed half his neighborhood, but his hands were steady as he worked on the explosives that might one day free their world. The room held 23 people, all that remained of what had once been a resistance cell of over 200. The Zephyrians were very good at finding humans who caused trouble, and they did not believe in taking prisoners. Jake looked at the faces around him and wondered how many would be alive next week, next month, next year. Maria Santos stepped out of the shadows near the back wall. She had been gone for 3 days, working her job as a translator in the Zephyrian command center above the city. The aliens needed humans who could speak their crystal song language, and Maria had learned it by watching her family die when she could not understand the orders being shouted at them. Now she used that skill to spy on their captors. Her face was pale, and her hands shook as she sat down in the circle of humans. Jake knew that look. It was the same expression people got when they learned something that changed everything, something that made all their small plans and careful hopes seem foolish. Maria spoke in a whisper that barely carried across the small room. The Zephyrians were planning to move all humans to a world called Kronos 7, a mining planet where the air was poison, and the work was harder than anything on Earth. The aliens had done this before with other species they had conquered. They would work the humans to death in 20 years, and then find a new species to replace them. The room fell silent except for the sound of water dripping somewhere in the darkness. Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach as he realized what this meant. All their fighting, all their hiding, all their careful plans to slowly build a resistance that might free Earth someday. None of it mattered now. The Zephyrians were going to kill them all anyway, just more slowly than they had killed the others. Ben Rodriguez was the first to speak, his voice rough with old pain and new anger. He said they should fight now, today, with everything they had. Better to die as humans than live as slaves on some alien world, until the poison air finished what the gravity weapons had started. Lisa Carter shook her head and said they needed time to plan, time to build better weapons, time to contact the other resistance cells around the world. But Maria Santos looked up with tears in her eyes and told them there was no time. The ships were already being prepared. The first groups of humans would be moved to Kronos 7 in just 3 months. Jake Morrison sat in the darkness and felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders like a stone. He had spent 15 years being careful, being smart, keeping his people alive by staying hidden and striking only when they could escape safely. But careful and smart would not save them from the poison air of Kronos 7. Sometimes the only choice left was between dying on your feet or dying on your knees. He stood up and looked at the faces around him, these last free humans in a world of slaves. Tomorrow they would begin Operation Breakout, and they would either free their species or die trying. Jake Morrison smiled in the darkness and began to plan humanity's last desperate gamble for freedom. The message went out through broken radio waves and hidden fiber cables, traveling through the underground networks that the Zephyrians had never bothered to completely destroy. In London, Dr. Emma Thompson received the coded transmission while working in the basement laboratory she had built beneath the ruins of the British Museum. The message was simple: 3 months until the end, time to show the galaxy what humans were made of. Emma had been working on her gravity disruptor for 7 years, ever since she had watched Zephyrian ships lift Big Ben into the sky and drop it on Parliament as a demonstration of their power. The device was ugly and crude compared to alien technology, built from salvaged human electronics and stolen Zephyrian components that she had traded her food rations to acquire. But it worked, at least in small doses, creating interference that could make a Zephyrian weapon fail for a few precious seconds. She sent her own message through the network, confirming that her weapons would be ready when the time came. Then she went back to work, her hands steady despite the knowledge that she was probably building devices that would get her killed. The disruptors were powerful enough to affect Zephyrian technology, but they were also powerful enough to melt human brains if used incorrectly. Still, melted brains were better than poison air on Kronos 7. Half a world away in the Australian outback, Danny Williams read the message on a tablet that had been jury-rigged to pick up resistance communications. Danny was one of the few humans who had never been captured by the Zephyrians, using knowledge passed down from his grandfather to hide in places where the crystal ships could not follow. The Red Desert was full of caves and hidden water sources, and Danny knew them all. For 10 years, he had been leading hit-and-run attacks against Zephyrian mining operations, using the land itself as a weapon. The aliens could control gravity, but they could not control flash floods or sandstorms or the 1,000 ways that Earth could kill someone who did not understand its moods. Danny's small band of fighters had cost the Zephyrians more resources than any other resistance cell, simply because they fought like the land itself, patient, invisible, and absolutely deadly. Danny looked up at the stars that his people had been watching for 50,000 years, and made his decision. If humanity was going to die, they would die fighting, the way his ancestors had fought when strangers came to take their land. He began planning raids that would make the Zephyrians understand that Earth would not give up her children without a fight. High above the planet, Captain Alex Chen stood on the bridge of the UES Liberty and watched the blue marble that had once been humanity's home. His ship was one of only 3 human vessels that had escaped during the invasion, running dark between the asteroids for 30 years while the crew slowly grew old and died. Now the Liberty carried the last free humans in space, 47 men and women who had been born among the stars and had never felt Earth's gravity beneath their feet. Alex had been coordinating with the resistance cells for 15 years, using the ship's sensors to track Zephyrian movements and relay information between groups that could not contact each other directly. The Liberty was almost out of fuel and spare parts, held together by skill and prayer and the stubborn refusal of her crew to let the last symbol of human space travel die in the cold between worlds. When Jake Morrison's message reached the ship, Alex felt something he had not experienced in years: hope mixed with terror in equal measure. Operation Breakout would either free humanity or destroy the resistance completely, and Alex knew that his ship would play a crucial role. The Liberty's sensors were the only way to coordinate attacks across the globe, and her weapons, ancient, and failing as they were, might be the key to success. The plan was ambitious beyond anything the Resistance had ever attempted. Every cell on Earth would strike simultaneously, targeting Zephyrian facilities, while Emma Thompson's disruptors created chaos in their gravity networks. Danny Williams would lead attacks on mining operations, while Jake Morrison's people struck at the command centers floating above the cities. It would be coordination on a scale that required perfect timing and massive luck, but as the Resistance prepared for their desperate gamble, they discovered something that changed everything. The message traffic between cells had been intercepted by Zephyrian intelligence, not to stop the Resistance, but to study it. The aliens had been allowing small pockets of human fighters to exist as a form of pressure valve, letting just enough resistance survive to prevent larger uprisings from forming. Lisa Carter made the discovery while analyzing communication patterns from the past decade. The Zephyrians had been playing a longer game than anyone realized, using human psychology against itself. They let resistance cells form and then quietly eliminated the most effective leaders, leaving behind groups that were just large enough to give other humans hope, but too small to pose any real threat. The realization hit the Resistance like a physical blow. Everything they had accomplished, every small victory they had won, had been permitted by their enemies. The Zephyrians had been studying human behavior for 30 years, learning how to break their spirits completely. The move to Kronos 7 was not just about mining. It was about making sure humanity never again produced the kind of stubborn fighters who refused to accept defeat. But knowledge of the trap also revealed its weakness. The Zephyrians understood human psychology, but they had made one crucial error. They thought that learning of their manipulation would break human morale completely, that the Resistance would collapse when they realized how thoroughly they had been controlled. Instead, the opposite happened. Jake Morrison stood in his tunnel and felt rage burn through him like fire. The aliens had not just conquered humanity. They had been playing with them, studying them like insects in a laboratory. Every friend who had died, every small victory that had given the survivors hope, had all been part of an experiment to see how long humans could be kept fighting before their spirits finally broke. The rage spread through the Resistance network, like a virus, but it was not the desperate fury of the defeated. It was the cold, calculating anger of people who had discovered that their enemies were not gods, but merely scientists conducting an experiment. And experiments could be disrupted, their conclusions proven wrong, their carefully controlled conditions, shattered by variables the researchers had not anticipated. As word spread through the tunnels and hidden bases, a new message began to travel alongside the plans for Operation Breakout. The Zephyrians had studied humanity for 30 years, but they had studied slaves and survivors and broken people trying to rebuild what had been lost. They had never studied humans who knew they were being watched, humans who could plan with. The knowledge that their enemies thought they understood everything about how human minds worked. The Resistance began to change their plans, not abandoning Operation Breakout, but adapting it in ways that would surprise aliens who thought they had mapped every human behavioral pattern. Jake Morrison smiled in the darkness of his tunnel and realized that humanity's greatest experiment was about to begin. The test of whether beings who had conquered dozens of worlds could handle a species that refused to behave the way it was supposed to. The first contact came through a frequency that should not have existed, a crystalline harmony that bypassed human radio entirely and spoke directly to the Resistance communication systems. Lisa Carter was monitoring the networks when the alien voice filled the tunnel, speaking in perfect English but with undertones that made the air itself vibrate. The voice called itself Crystal Song of Rebellion, and it claimed to be one of many Zephyrians who had grown tired of the Empire's endless conquests. Jake Morrison listened to the transmission with his hand on his weapon, expecting a trap, But the aliens' words carried information that no Zephyrian spy would have shared. It told them about the other species the Empire had conquered, about worlds where entire civilizations had been ground down to nothing in the space of a few generations, but it also told them something that made Jake's heart race with possibility. Humanity was different from the other conquered species in ways that the Empire's leadership did not fully understand. Most intelligent life in the galaxy thought in patterns that could be predicted and controlled, their minds following logical pathways that Zephyrian crystal technology could manipulate. Human thoughts were chaotic, emotional, and utterly unpredictable in ways that made the Empire's standard control methods much less effective. Crystal Song of Rebellion explained that this was why the Zephyrians had needed to use psychological manipulation instead of direct mental control on Earth. Human minds simply would not stay in the patterns that alien technology required, jumping from logic to emotion to pure stubborn instinct in ways that confused even the most advanced Zephyrian scientists. The revelation changed everything. The Resistance thought they knew about their situation. They were not just another conquered species waiting to be slowly destroyed. They were an anomaly that had been puzzling the Empire for 30 years, a species that refused to break the way they were supposed to break. And according to Crystal Song of Rebellion, word of human resistance had spread throughout the Empire, inspiring other conquered peoples to remember what it felt like to fight back. Lisa Carter found herself working alongside the alien rebel, trying to understand Zephyrian technology well enough to turn it against the Empire. Crystal Song of Rebellion communicated through harmonic frequencies that Lisa could barely perceive, but the alien was patient in ways that surprised her. It had been watching the Resistance for years, learning human methods and human thinking, preparing for the day when it might be possible to fight alongside them. The collaboration produced results that neither species could have achieved alone. Lisa's chaotic human creativity combined with Zephyrian technical knowledge to create weapons that worked in ways their original designers had never intended. The gravity disruptors became not just tools for disrupting alien technology, but devices that could actually redirect Zephyrian weapons against their users. Ben Rodriguez led the first test of the new weapons during a raid on a Zephyrian supply depot outside Chicago. The depot was defended by gravity fields that could crush human bones and weapons that could make the ground itself rise up to swallow attackers. But the modified disruptors turned the defensive systems into chaos, gravity fields spinning out of control and weapons firing randomly as their harmonic frequencies were jammed by hybrid human-alien technology. The raid succeeded beyond their wildest hopes, capturing enough Zephyrian equipment to outfit resistance cells across North America. But more importantly, it proved that the aliens were not invincible. Their technology could be confused, their weapons could be turned against them, and their perfect control could be shattered by creatures that refused to think the way they were supposed to think. Word of the success spread through the resistance networks faster than any official communication. Humans who had spent 30 years believing they were helpless against alien technology suddenly realized that their enemies could be hurt, could be confused, could even be defeated. The psychological impact was enormous, transforming a resistance movement of desperate survivors into an army of people who believed they could actually win. But success came with a price that no one had anticipated. Maria Santos was discovered during one of her intelligence gathering missions to the Zephyrian Command Center. She had been feeding information to the Resistance for 2 years, but the aliens had finally noticed patterns in their security breaches that led back to their human translator. Jake Morrison received the news while planning the next phase of Operation Breakout. Maria had been captured during what should have been a routine information drop, caught by Zephyrian security systems that had been upgraded after the Chicago raid. The aliens were learning from their defeats just as quickly as the humans were, adapting their defenses and tightening their security with each successful resistance operation. The capture led to a rescue mission that almost destroyed Jake's entire cell. Ben Rodriguez insisted on leading the assault on the floating detention facility where Maria was being held, convinced that they could save her before the Zephyrians extracted everything she knew about the resistance. Lisa Carter argued that it was too dangerous, that they could not risk the entire operation for one person, no matter how valuable. But Jake made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. They would attempt the rescue, not because it was logical or safe, but because abandoning Maria would mean abandoning the very humanity they were fighting to preserve. If they could sacrifice their friends to tactical necessity, then they had already lost the war that mattered most. The assault on the detention facility succeeded, but only barely. Ben Rodriguez fought his way through gravity fields that should have killed him, using the new disruptor weapons to carve a path through defenses that had been considered impregnable. He reached Maria's cell just as the Zephyrian interrogation began. The alien harmonics designed to shatter human minds and extract every memory. Maria Santos died in Ben's arms as he carried her toward the escape route, her mind burned out by alien frequencies that human brains were never meant to endure. Her last words were coordinates for a Zephyrian facility that she had discovered during her final intelligence mission, a place where the aliens were building something that would change the nature of the war completely. The coordinates led to a construction site in orbit around Earth, where Zephyrian engineers were assembling a weapon unlike anything they had built before. Captain Alex Chen observed the construction from the Liberty's sensors, watching as the aliens connected massive gravity generators to harmonic amplifiers that could affect entire continents. The weapon was designed to solve the human problem permanently, creating gravity fields that would crush every resistance fighter and rebellious civilian on Earth simultaneously. Crystal's song of rebellion confirmed their worst fears when the next transmission reached the underground networks. The device was called the World Ender, and it represented the Empire's final solution to the human anomaly. Rather than try to control or transport the human population, they would simply eliminate it and find a more manageable species to work the mines. The construction would be complete in 6 weeks, giving the resistance barely enough time to plan a response. But for the first time since the invasion began, humanity was not facing the crisis alone. Messages from the Outer Rim territories told of uprisings on a dozen worlds, conquered species inspired by human stubbornness to remember their own capacity for resistance. The Galactic Liberation Front was born in the tunnels beneath New York City, an alliance of rebels from species that had never worked together before. Crystal's Song of Rebellion became the first non-human member, but messages from other worlds brought news of similar defections among the Zephyrian forces. The Empire that had seemed so monolithic was beginning to crack, split by species that had learned from human example that their conquerors could be defeated. Jake Morrison stood in his tunnel and realized that humanity had become something they had never intended to be, the spark that would either ignite galactic revolution or burn out in the attempt. The World Ender was coming, but it would face more than just human resistance when it arrived. It would face the combined fury of every species that had ever been told they were too weak to fight back. The first retaliations began 3 days after Maria Santos died in Ben Rodriguez's arms. Zephyrian forces descended on human settlements with a brutality that had not been seen since the initial invasion, executing civilians in groups of 10 for every act of resistance. The floating cities became galleries of horror as alien soldiers demonstrated what happened to species that forgot their place in the Empire's order. Jake Morrison watched the executions through hijacked communication feeds and felt something break inside him that he had not known was still whole. These were not soldiers dying for a cause they believed in. These were children and teachers and shopkeepers being murdered because humanity had dared to fight back. The Zephyrians were making it clear that every human death was on the resistance's conscience. Every family destroyed was the price of their rebellion, but the executions had an effect that the aliens had not anticipated. Instead of breaking human morale, they revealed the true nature of the Empire to species across the galaxy who had been told that the Zephyrians were benevolent rulers bringing order to chaos. Crystal Song of Rebellion transmitted recordings of the massacres throughout the Empire's communication networks, showing conquered worlds exactly what their masters were capable of when their authority was challenged. Dr. Emma Thompson completed her work on the Harmony Disruptor, while smoke rose from burning cities above her hidden laboratory. The device was larger than anything she had built before, a fusion of human engineering and stolen Zephyrian technology that could theoretically disrupt gravity control across an entire continent. But it was also unstable in ways that made her hands shake as she made the final connections. The disruptor required more power than Earth's remaining electrical grid could provide, drawing energy from sources that would burn out after a single use. Worse, the harmonic frequencies it generated would cause permanent damage to any human brain within 10 kilometers of the device when it activated. It was a weapon that could only be used once, by someone willing to die in the process. Lisa Carter argued with Ben Rodriguez for hours about the ethics of using weapons that caused pain to their Zephyrian allies. The hybrid technology that made their new weapons possible worked by disrupting the crystalline nervous systems that all Zephyrians shared, causing agony that was apparently worse than any human torture. Ben insisted that the aliens had forfeited any right to mercy when they started executing civilians, while Lisa maintained that becoming monsters would make their victory meaningless. The debate spread through the resistance networks as reports came in of Zephyrian rebels suffering from exposure to the modified human weapons. Crystal Song of Rebellion itself had been damaged during the Chicago raid, its crystalline structure fractured by the harmonic interference that made the mission possible. The alien assured them that it accepted the pain as necessary, but Lisa could hear the suffering in its translated communications. Jake Morrison found himself caught between competing visions of what humanity should become. Ben Rodriguez represented the fury of people who had lost everything and wanted their enemies to pay any price for what they had done. Lisa Carter spoke for those who believed that winning through torture and atrocity would transform the resistance into the very thing they were fighting against. Both sides were right, and both sides were wrong, and the decision would define what humanity became after the war ended. The choice was taken away from them when Captain Alex Chen detected Zephyrian forces moving toward the Australian outback, hunting for Danny Williams and his fighters. The aliens had finally decided to eliminate the most effective resistance cell on Earth, sending gravity weapons that could turn the Red Desert into a sea of glass. Danny's people had nowhere to run and no way to fight back against weapons that could liquefy stone. Ben Rodriguez volunteered to take a team to Australia with the new weapons, knowing that using them against a large Zephyrian force would cause massive suffering to any alien rebels in the area. Lisa Carter begged him not to go, arguing that they needed time to develop weapons that could distinguish between Empire forces and their allies. But time was what they did not have, and Danny Williams would be dead long before better weapons could be built. The battle in the outback lasted for 6 hours and could be seen from orbit as competing gravity fields tore the landscape apart. Ben Rodriguez's team used the modified disruptors to turn Zephyrian weapons against each other, while Danny Williams led his fighters in attacks that used the terrain itself as cover. The red rocks that had hidden his people for 10 years became weapons as gravity fields went out of control and began moving mountains. The resistance won, but the victory left scars on everyone who witnessed it. Captured Zephyrian soldiers writhed in agony from the harmonic weapons, while their own gravity devices crushed them under the weight of distorted space-time. Some of the aliens begged for death in frequencies that human ears could barely perceive, while others simply shut down their crystalline nervous systems and waited for the pain to end. Danny Williams found Ben Rodriguez sitting alone after the battle, staring at a Zephyrian soldier who had been caught in the feedback from a disrupted gravity projector. The alien was still alive but trapped in a field that was slowly stretching its crystalline body apart, creating frequencies of pain that registered on every scanner in the area. Ben held a human weapon that could end the creature's suffering, but his hand would not move to pull the trigger. Crystal Song of Rebellion's next transmission carried news that changed the nature of the conflict completely. The executions on Earth and the battle in Australia had triggered uprisings on 17 worlds across the Empire, but they had also prompted the Zephyrian High Council to accelerate their timeline. The World Ender would be completed in 2 weeks rather than 6, and it would be deployed against Earth as soon as the final components were installed, but the transmission also carried intelligence that gave the Resistance their first real hope of victory. The World Ender's gravity systems were controlled by a central harmonic core that maintained the delicate balance needed to manipulate planetary forces. If that core could be disrupted at the moment of activation, the feedback would destroy not just the weapon, but the entire Zephyrian fleet surrounding it. Emma Thompson's Harmony Disruptor was powerful enough to cause the necessary interference, but only if it could be activated from inside the World Ender itself. Someone would need to infiltrate the massive alien ship, place the device at the exact center of the gravity control systems, and trigger it manually. The radiation from the process would kill anyone within 100 kilometers of the weapon, making it a suicide mission with no possibility of rescue or escape. The Resistance fell silent as the implications became clear. They had found a way to stop the World Ender and save Earth, but it would require someone to sacrifice their life in the most final way possible. The person who triggered the disruptor would not just die. They would be unmade at the quantum level, their very atoms scattered across space as the gravity fields collapsed. Ben Rodriguez was the first to volunteer, saying that he had been looking for a way to join Maria Santos since the day she died in his arms. Lisa Carter argued that they needed his tactical expertise for other missions, while Jake Morrison insisted that the mission was too important to risk on someone whose judgment might be clouded by grief. But Ben's response silenced all objections. He pointed out that the Harmony Disruptor required someone who understood both human and Zephyrian technology, someone who had used the hybrid weapons enough to know how they would interact with alien systems. More importantly, it required someone who could complete the mission even if they were captured and tortured, someone who had already lost everything that mattered and had nothing left to protect except the future of the human species. Captain Alex Chen confirmed what everyone already knew when his sensors detected the World Ender beginning its final approach to Earth. The massive ship was surrounded by the largest Zephyrian fleet ever assembled, hundreds of vessels that could sterilize continents if the gravity weapon failed to function properly. In 72 hours, one way or another, the war would be over. Jake Morrison stood in his tunnel and looked at the faces of the people who had followed him into the darkness for so many years. They had started as desperate survivors hiding from forces they could not understand, and they had become the center of a galactic revolution that might free dozens of worlds from tyranny. But all of that would mean nothing if they could not stop the World Ender from turning Earth into a lifeless rock floating in space. The final phase of Operation Breakout would begin in 18 hours, coordinated with uprisings across the galaxy, and supported by weapons that had been built from human stubbornness and alien defection. Humanity would either win its freedom or die in the attempt, but they would face their fate as themselves rather than as the broken slaves the Empire had tried to create. The World Ender blotted out the stars as it settled into position above Earth's North Pole, its crystalline hull stretching for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. From the surface, it looked like a second moon made of black glass and malevolent purpose, its gravity projectors already beginning to affect Earth's magnetic field in ways that made compasses spin wildly and caused aurora displays at the equator. Jake Morrison watched the massive ship through stolen Zephyrian sensors and felt the weight of 30 years of war settling on his shoulders. Everything the Resistance had fought for, every life that had been lost, every small victory that had kept hope alive, It all came down to the next 6 hours and Ben Rodriguez's willingness to die alone in the heart of an alien dreadnought. The assault began with attacks across every continent as resistance cells emerged from hiding places they had occupied for decades. Danny Williams led Aboriginal fighters in raids against Zephyrian installations in Australia, while Dr. Emma Thompson's weapons disrupted gravity fields across Europe. But these were distractions, desperate attempts to draw attention away from the real mission that would determine humanity's fate. Captain Alex Chen brought the UES Liberty out of hiding for the first time in 30 years, her ancient engines burning fuel they could not replace as she climbed toward the Zephyrian fleet. The Liberty was joined by ships from a dozen liberated worlds, vessels that had traveled across the galaxy to stand with the species that had shown them resistance was possible. The combined fleet was tiny compared to the Empire's forces, but it carried the fury of every civilization that had ever been conquered. Ben Rodriguez rode in the belly of a captured Zephyrian transport, disguised as a prisoner being transferred to the World Ender for interrogation. The Harmony disruptor was hidden in a medical scanner that the aliens would not expect to contain weapons, its components scattered across multiple devices to avoid detection. Ben had memorized the ship's layout from intelligence provided by Crystal Song of Rebellion, but he knew that plans rarely survived contact with reality. The transport docked with the World Ender just as the space battle reached its peak intensity above Earth's atmosphere. Ben could feel the massive ship's gravity, projectors warming up through the hull, preparing to reach down and grab Earth's core with forces that could crack continents. He had perhaps 30 minutes before the weapon achieved full power and made his mission irrelevant. Lisa Carter coordinated the ground assault from the tunnels beneath New York, watching as every resistance cell on Earth struck simultaneously at targets they had been observing for years. The attacks were not meant to defeat the Zephyrian forces, but to create enough chaos to mask the signal from Ben's mission. If the aliens realized what was happening aboard the World Ender before he could complete his work, they would flood the ship with gravity fields that would crush him before he could reach the harmonic core. The interior of the World Ender was like nothing Ben had ever seen. Corridors that stretched in directions that should not have existed, and gravity fields that pointed in multiple directions at once. Zephyrian crew members moved through the impossible architecture like living crystals, their harmonics creating music that human ears could barely perceive. Ben followed the memorized route toward the ship's center, hoping that the aliens would be too focused on the battle outside to notice one human moving through passages meant for prisoners. He reached the harmonic core just as the World Ender's main weapon achieved 50% power, gravity projectors extending invisible fingers toward Earth's surface in preparation for the final assault. The core was a crystalline structure larger than a city building, its faceted surfaces reflecting light that came from no visible source. Standing next to it, Ben felt like an insect contemplating the destruction of a mountain. The Harmony disruptor assembled itself from components that Ben had carried in his clothing and hidden in his body, human technology merging with stolen Zephyrian devices to create something that neither species could have built alone. The device was ugly compared to the elegant alien architecture around it, a crude fusion of metal and crystal that looked like it had been built in someone's garage. But it would work, and that was all that mattered. Crystal Song of Rebellions. Voice reached Ben through frequencies that bypassed the ship's communication systems, offering guidance as he connected the disruptor to the harmonic core's control systems. The alien rebel was risking its own existence by helping with the sabotage, knowing that the feedback from the device would destroy every Zephyrian within 100 kilometers of the explosion. Ben activated the disruptor just as Zephyrian security forces discovered his presence in the core chamber. Gravity weapons fired harmonic frequencies that should have crushed him instantly, but the device was already interfering with the ship's systems in ways that made precise targeting impossible. The World Ender shuddered as competing gravity fields began tearing at its internal structure. The space battle above Earth reached its climax as the Liberty led her small fleet in a desperate assault on the Zephyrian command ship. Captain Alex. Chen knew that they could not win through superior firepower, but they could buy time for Ben to complete his mission. The old human ship burned through the last of her ammunition, her crew firing everything they had at enemies that barely noticed their attacks. Jake Morrison felt the ground shake beneath New York City as the World Ender's gravity projectors began, affecting Earth's crust, pulling at tectonic plates in ways that would reshape continents if the weapon reached full power. He could see the alien ship through the tunnel entrance, a dark star hanging in the sky above a world that was about to die. Everything they had fought for was in Ben Rodriguez's hands now. Ben worked frantically to complete the disruptor's connection. As Zephyrian forces closed in around him, their crystalline bodies moving through gravity fields that would have flattened human bone. The device was responding to the harmonic core's frequencies, building toward a resonance that would either save Earth or destroy it in the attempt. Ben's hands moved across controls that were labeled in languages no human had ever learned, following instincts that came from 30 years of fighting alien technology. The feedback began as a whisper that made the World Ender's crystal walls sing, but it grew rapidly into a harmonic cascade that spread through every system on the massive ship. Gravity projectors designed to crush planets turned their force inward, tearing at the ship that contained them. The Zephyrian crew tried desperately to shut down the weapon, but the disruptor had created a resonance loop that fed on the very power they were trying to cut. Lisa Carter watched from Earth as the World Ender began to tear itself apart, its crystalline hull cracking as competing gravity fields pulled it in directions that defied physics. The massive ship that had seemed invincible just minutes before was destroying itself, taking the entire Zephyrian fleet with it as the harmonic cascade spread to every vessel in the battle group. Ben Rodriguez stood at the center of the chaos. As reality came apart around him, the Harmony Disruptor creating forces that human science had never imagined. He thought about Maria Santos in his final moments, wondering if she could see what her death had made possible. The World Ender's core collapsed into itself just as the gravity projectors reached critical resonance, creating a brief star that could be seen from every continent on Earth. The explosion was visible across half the galaxy, a flash of light that announced to every conquered world that the Empire's greatest weapon had been destroyed by the species they had considered least dangerous. Captain Alex Chen watched from the Liberty as debris from hundreds of Zephyrian ships rained down on Earth's atmosphere, burning up like meteors in a sky that was free for the first time in 30 years. Jake Morrison emerged from his tunnel to see dawn breaking over New York City, sunlight reflecting off floating debris that had once been the most powerful fleet in the galaxy. The World Ender was gone, reduced to quantum particles scattered across space, and with it had died the Empire's ability to project force on an interstellar scale. Humanity had won its freedom, but the price had been paid by people like Ben Rodriguez and Maria Santos, heroes who would never see the world they had died to save. Crystal Song of Rebellion's final transmission reached Earth just as the last pieces of the Zephyrian fleet fell into the planet's gravity well. The alien rebel had survived the explosion, protected by distance and luck, and its message carried news that would reshape the galaxy. The destruction of the World Ender had triggered uprisings on 50 worlds, conquered species inspired by humanity's example to throw off chains they had worn for centuries. The silence that followed the World Ender's destruction was the first true quiet that Earth had known in 30 years. No more crystal ships hummed through the atmosphere, no more gravity fields pressed down on human cities, no more harmonic. Frequencies reminded the survivors that they lived at the mercy of their conquerors. Jake Morrison stood in the ruins of Times Square and listened to the sound of wind blowing through empty streets, a sound he had almost forgotten existed. The Zephyrian Empire began to fracture within days of losing their greatest weapon and most powerful fleet. Crystal Song of Rebellion emerged as a leader among the aliens who had grown tired of conquest, forming the Zephyrian Republic in opposition to the old Empire's authoritarian rule. The new government's first act was to formally apologize to every species they had conquered and to begin the process of dismantling the vast network of oppression that had held the galaxy in chains for centuries. But forgiveness would not come easily or quickly. Lisa Carter found herself appointed to lead the new Earth government's negotiations with alien species, a position she had never wanted but could not refuse. Too many humans had died for the peace to be anything other than carefully earned, and too many wounds had been opened for them to heal without deliberate effort. The floating cities came down one by one, their Zephyrian technology repurposed to help rebuild what had been destroyed. Dr. Emma Thompson became the first director of the Terran Science Council, tasked with ensuring that humanity would never again be vulnerable to technological superiority. Her work on hybrid human-alien technology became the foundation for a new generation of innovations that combined human creativity with alien precision. The weapons that had won the war were transformed into tools for exploration and construction, gravity manipulators becoming the engines for ships that could cross the galaxy in weeks rather than years. Captain Alex Chen brought the Liberty home, to Earth for the first time in 30 years, her ancient hull scarred by battles across half the galaxy, but still intact. The ship became a museum and a symbol, proof that human determination could outlast any technology when backed by the refusal to surrender. Alex himself became humanity's first ambassador to the Galactic Liberation Council, the democratic body that replaced the Empire's rigid hierarchy. The memorial service for those lost in the struggle was held in Central Park, where the Resistance had planned their final desperate gambit. Representatives from dozens of worlds came to honor the humans who had shown the galaxy that freedom was possible. But the ceremony was not about celebrating victory. It was about remembering the price that had been paid and the responsibility that came with the knowledge that other species had followed humanity's example into revolution. Jake Morrison spoke to the assembled crowd, his voice carrying across speakers that translated his words into frequencies that crystalline beings and gas cloud entities could understand. He talked about Maria Santos, who had died gathering the intelligence that made victory possible, and about Ben Rodriguez, who had sacrificed everything to ensure that Earth would survive. But mostly he talked about the ordinary people who had kept fighting when fighting seemed pointless, who had maintained their humanity when it would have been easier to become monsters. The changes came slowly but steadily as Earth reconnected with the galaxy that had forgotten it existed. Trade routes opened between worlds that had been isolated for centuries, carrying not just goods but ideas and art and the dreams of species that were learning to trust each other. Humans found themselves welcomed as liberators on worlds where the name Earth had become synonymous with the hope that oppression could be overcome. Danny Williams returned to the Australian outback with a group of young people who wanted to learn how to read the land the way his ancestors had. The Red Desert had been scarred by the final battle, its ancient rocks cracked by competing gravity fields, but life was already returning to the damaged areas. Danny taught his students that the land remembered everything, including the day that humanity had proven it would not be broken by forces beyond its understanding. The floating debris from the destroyed Zephyrian fleet became a resource that transformed Earth's technology almost overnight. Materials that had been impossible to obtain during the occupation became available in vast quantities, allowing human engineers to build structures that rivaled anything the aliens had created. But more importantly, the debris contained complete databases of Zephyrian knowledge, information that had been gathered across centuries of conquest and exploration. Lisa Carter worked with Crystal Song of Rebellion to establish the Galactic Archive, a repository of knowledge from every species that had ever been part of the Empire. The archive was built on Luna, far enough from Earth to be neutral ground, but close enough for human oversight. It became a place where former enemies could work together to preserve the wisdom that had been accumulated during the galaxy's dark age. The children who had been born during the occupation grew up in a world that was strange to their parents, a place where alien visitors walked through human cities and where gravity manipulation was as common as electricity had been in the old days. These children learned languages that had never been spoken on Earth and played games that required thinking in dimensions their grandparents could not perceive. Jake Morrison often watched these children playing in the rebuilt parks and wondered what kind of adults they would become. They had been born into struggle, but would grow up in freedom, shaped by both the trauma of the occupation and the hope of the liberation. He hoped they would remember the lessons of the war without being consumed by its hatred, that they would build something better than what had been destroyed. The Zephyrian Republic sent aid to help rebuild Earth's damaged ecosystems, using their gravity technology to repair the environmental damage caused by 30 years of intensive mining. Forests began to grow again in areas that had been strip-mined for rare metals, and the ocean slowly recovered from the pollution that had been dumped into them during the occupation. The planet that had been scarred by alien exploitation began to heal under the care of its liberated children. Crystal Song of Rebellion established a permanent embassy in the rebuilt United Nations building, serving as a bridge between species that were still learning to trust each other. The alien diplomat worked tirelessly to prevent the kind of misunderstandings that could lead to new conflicts, knowing that the peace between humans and Zephyrians was still fragile and required constant attention. 10 years after the world enders. Destruction. Humanity had become something that neither they nor their former oppressors had expected. Earth was no longer just a mining world or a source of slave labor, but a center of learning and innovation that attracted visitors from across the galaxy. The species that had once been considered too chaotic to control had become the heart of a new civilization built on cooperation rather than conquest. Jake Morrison stood once again in the tunnels beneath New York City, but now they served a different purpose. The abandoned subway stations had been converted into museums that told the story of the resistance, preserving the memory of those who had fought and died for freedom. School children from dozens of worlds came to see where the rebellion had been born, learning about the power of ordinary people to change the course of history. The final exhibit was a simple plaque that bore the names of all those who had died in the struggle, from the first resistance fighters killed in the initial invasion to Ben Rodriguez, who had given his life to destroy the world ender. But the plaque also carried a message that Jake had written himself, words that he hoped would be remembered long after the current generation had passed into history. The message was simple. Humanity was forged in struggle, tempered by loss, and strengthened by the knowledge that freedom is not a gift but a responsibility. We who survived the darkness swear that no species shall again suffer as we suffered, and that the light of liberty shall shine on every world that chooses to embrace it. Above the tunnels, New York City bustled with activity as beings from dozens of worlds worked together to build something that had never existed before, a truly free galaxy where strength came not from the ability to conquer, but from the willingness to cooperate. The floating cities that had once been symbols of oppression had become gardens in the sky, their Zephyrian technology repurposed to create beauty rather than control. Children played in those gardens, human and alien alike, their laughter echoing through the crystal corridors as they chased each other through forests that grew in artificial gravity. They were the first generation to grow up truly free, unburdened by the hatred and fear that had shaped their parents' lives. They would inherit a galaxy where anything was possible because a species of stubborn, chaotic, utterly unpredictable beings had refused to accept that their situation was hopeless. Humanity had been forged in struggle, but their greatest victory was not the destruction of the world ender or the liberation of Earth. Their greatest victory was the proof that even the smallest and weakest could inspire others to remember what they had lost and fight to reclaim it.